If you watched last week, you might remember. If you watched last week, you might not. It's okay. It's been 7 days, 167 hours since I preached the last time. So if you don't remember, all right, perfectly fine. But last week we talked about Jesus' first sermon. He's in the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, it's billed as his first sermon at home. In the Gospel of Luke, if you're familiar, the first chapter is really a lot about how Jesus came to be. Elizabeth, Mary's cousin Elizabeth, and the fact that even though she was way past childbearing years, she gave birth to a son, John the Baptizer, we know him as. And then Mary also met with the Holy Spirit, had a long conversation, said some things that we remember as the Magnificat, only because the first word in the phrase is Magnificat in Latin. That's how they name things in our in our Roman Catholic tradition. Is the Magnificat is because the first word in Latin is Magnificat, and so the first chapter is that. The second chapter, you'll remember, it's that beautiful little story, Christmas Eve. I tell it every year. Caesar Augustus, angels, shepherds, Jesus, stars, all that kind of stuff. It's all in there. And we move on to Jesus being tempted in the wilderness and the like. And then we come to, we also get the one story of Jesus' adolescence when he scares the bejeebers out of his parents. And now we move into chapter 4. He comes home. His hometown has heard a lot about him, and he gives as his first message, he starts his first message by reading from the prophet Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And that was what we really were focused on last week. Then Jesus says some things. Now, if I'd been paying attention last week, I wouldn't have read that to you. I would have saved to read it to you today, but I'm just going to read the second half today because you'd think, Jesus, popular preacher, everyone loves him. This is a moment when he says some things. The beginning of his ministry was close to being the end. You preach that one sermon, ticks off everyone in the congregation, and they want to throw you off a cliff. Which is literally what happens in this story. So let's begin in chapter 4 of the Gospel of Luke, and I'm beginning in verse. I'll begin in verse 20. It's a recap. Jesus has just read from the scroll, and he rolls up the scroll. Jesus gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of all the synagogue were fixed on him. That's because he sat down. When you sit down, that's when teaching happens. We think of teachers standing up. In Jesus' time, teachers sat down. So he sits down. All eyes were upon him, waiting for something powerful, and he said to them, "Today, in your hearing, this scripture passage is fulfilled." Everyone was there, spoke favorably of him. They marveled at the eloquence of the words on Jesus' lips. They said, "Surely this isn't Mary and Joseph's son." Jesus said to them, "Undoubtedly, you'll quote me the proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself,' and say, 'Do here in your own country the things we heard that you did in Capernaum.' But the truth is, prophets never gain acceptance in their hometowns." The truth is, there were many women who were widowed in Israel in the days of Elijah. And the heavens remained closed for 3.5 years, and a great famine spread over the land. It was none of these that Elijah was sent to, but a woman who had been widowed in Zarephath, near Sidon. Recall, too, that many had leprosy in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet. Yet none was cured except Naaman the Syrian. At these words, the whole audience in the synagogue was filled with indignation. They rose up and dragged Jesus out of town, leading him to the brow of the hill on which the city was built, with the intention of hurling him over the edge. But he moved straight through the crowd and walked away. This is the gospel of the Lord for this morning. Thanks be to God. Let me just say, Jesus is a very challenging character. We've kind of watered him down a little bit, made him real comfortable in some ways. For the most part, in modern society, we don't focus on things. I read an interesting article. Sometimes I do that on a Sunday morning when I probably should be doing something else. I read an interesting article because it came across my desk from someone. It came across my email. It doesn't fly across my desk like papers used to or anything like that. It came into my email box, and it was by Carey Nieuwhof, who's a pastor in Canada. And he comes into my email box every day, and some days I really like what he says, and some days it ticks me off. Usually things he ticks me off about are probably things I should do better at, etc. But he was talking about how in the church in America, he has repeatedly heard this story about pastors who preach on the Sermon on the Mount, particularly on the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those of a gentle spirit. Blessed are those who work for justice. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the peacemakers. I actually skipped. Blessed are the pure in heart. All of those. Blessed if you're persecuted. And that there are pastors who have congregant members and said, where did you get that woke stuff that you're talking about here in church? And that doesn't belong in here. Get that liberal stuff out of here. And it's like, this is what Jesus said in the Beatitudes. This is what Jesus said. Well, it's not good for today. It's not good for today. It's like when back in the early 2000s, someone came up to me after church one Sunday morning and said, James, I noticed you talk a lot about Jesus. Could you talk a little bit less about him? Could you talk a little bit less about him? And I was like, no, no, I can't. I was taken aback. And this person was serious. They weren't kidding me. They were like, maybe you should talk a little bit less about Jesus. And I was like, kind of the whole founder of this whole thing we do. We follow him. Got to talk about that. Got to talk about that guy. It's really interesting that it would be so unpopular to preach what Jesus said and to hold others accountable to those things that Jesus said, particularly in the Christian church. And yet, I think that Dr. B was so right that sometimes, in order to keep all of our all the trappings so nobody notices us, sometimes the church has been about surviving. Particularly today. I will tell you that some churches have really grown and come back after the pandemic. And other churches not so much. I will tell you that before the pandemic, there were a lot more people in person and a lot fewer people online. And now there's a lot more people online and a lot fewer people in person. And that's just the way that it is. That is just the way that it is. But when denominations start looking at numbers like that, they get really concerned. And they start trying to do things to circle the wagons so that they can survive. I think that unless we're doing the work of God, if we're doing the hard work of God, standing up to the powerful on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves, if we can't do that work, then we don't need to be doing any work at all. Maybe we should just sell our buildings and all go and do whatever we feel like doing. The church is called to do hard work. And when Jesus said to the folks who had come to synagogue, these were good, religious, first century people who came to hear the hometown boy give a good sermon that would make them feel good. They could go home and feel good about themselves. And I tend to try to give those kinds of sermons because I want you to feel good about yourself. God made you to be pretty awesome, made you to be the gift that you are. That's good news. But part of that good news is also that part of the gift that you are is to stand up for those who don't yet recognize what a gift they are. And stand up to people who think they're not a gift for whatever reason they've chosen. Because of the color of their skin, because of their immigration status, because of their gender or sexuality, any of those kinds of things. When we start letting powerful people speak ugly things to the most vulnerable in our society, then we have to stand up and say, hold on a second. You can tax us if you need to and take our buildings. We don't care about those things. Now, this is where the line gets drawn. Because we do care about those things. We like the buildings. We don't want to stand up to the powerful. What will they do? What will they take away from us? So we go along to get along. And sadly for the church, that's been mostly true since 325. The year 325. We've been kind of going along to get along. There was a lot bigger plurality of Christianity prior to 325 when we tried to define some things very clearly, who was on the inside, who was on the outside, and make sure that the outsiders knew that they better get on the inside or there was no life for them. And I do think that when the church started doing that, we got to a place where we kind of go along to get along. And instead of speaking truth into the world. Now, Jesus spoke a truth that the good religious people in his synagogue did not want to hear. And that is, you want this message to just be for you. You want me to tell you how awesome you are. Look at those heathens out there. They didn't even get up out of bed and come to church this morning. Ugh. That's what you'd like to hear because you want to feel good about what you did this morning. Now, not you, of course. All of you who are here, you're here because you want to be. That's what I hope anyway. You're here because you want to be, because you want to connect with God. You want to connect with each other. You want to be challenged and encouraged so you can go back out into the world and continue to stand up because you were blessed to be a blessing. I know that that's true. But those folks who appeared in the synagogue already felt like they had given up enough. They were under Roman oppression. The world wasn't what they wanted it to be. It was looking bad. So they wanted to hear, hey, you are the chosen people. God really loves you a lot. Everyone outside, crud balls. Or whatever ugly term you'd like to use. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus goes on to preach, having pulled out that beautiful passage from Isaiah. He goes on to say, listen, let me just tell you a little bit about history. There was a time when Elijah was the prophet. And Elijah looked out, and God, through Elijah, looked out for a non-Hebrew. And not just Elijah. Then Elisha, right after him. Elisha, there were lots of lepers in group among the Hebrew people. Did he heal any of them? Nope. But he healed this foreign guy, the Syrian, Naaman, who comes there, a general, but of all things, a general from another army, from a different place, who would stand against Israel, came to see Elisha, and he's cured. We could tell the whole story. That's for another day. At first he's indignant because Elisha tells him to go over and wash himself in the river, and he's like, I got a clean river back at home. No. And then he said, well, maybe I should. And he does, and there you go. Healed. We think it's for the insiders. The good news is for us, and the good news is for everyone. And we've got to remember that. And this is the hard work. This is why when I talk about this, it's a difficult calling. Jesus' first sermon was almost his last. The rest of the story could have almost ended, except that he, in a nonviolent way, just walked out among the people and left. We think of it as kind of magical. I used to think he must become invisible. How does this happen? I thought, there was some kind of, he put on his invisibility cloak like Harry Potter or something like that and walked out in front of them all. I don't know because they didn't see him. But whatever he did, he made his way right through the crowd that was ready to throw him over the edge. And that was his response. Now, I'm very fortunate. My first sermon, which was actually My first sermon in my home church, which was actually my second sermon, because my first sermon was at a different church on Scout Sunday, because that's where my troop met. And then my home church said, hey, why don't you come and preach over here? So I did. I'm very fortunate. My first sermon was not almost my last. No one tried to take me and throw me into the Elizabeth River, which is right next to my home church. No one did that. Whew. Good news for me. Maybe I wasn't as confrontational as Jesus. I don't think I was, probably. I was 15, 16 years old. What do I know? But Jesus really called things out. And that's the difficult thing. So we have to be looking at the world not through what works best for me, not what's going to make me feel good, not through my own set of preferences. Why can't everyone be like me? That would be a pretty boring world, although Linda thinks it would probably be a pretty irritating world because I'm really good at irritating her. 33 years of marriage, one of my best abilities, irritate Linda. So I have some other good abilities. Josh would say probably, mostly irritating mom. But the truth of that whole thing is that we're called to a difficult task. We have to speak a truth in the world, a truth about God's love that can't just include us. Because I'm convinced, for so long I can remember a rhetoric that went through the church that, people had to change so God could love them. And I think God loves us so that we can change. Love over a lifetime, despite the fact that I do get some kind of evil pleasure periodically of irritating Linda. My love for Linda has changed me over a lifetime. I'm a better human being after 33 years. Linda might even agree with me. I'm just going to say it for myself. And God's love, in an even bigger way, has made me a different human being. As I have come to truly accept God's love and act on it, it has transformed me. The more I have come to know Jesus and live through Jesus, that has made me a different person. Now, when Linda first met me, when I first came to St. James, I was conflict averse. Conflict was happening. I was going some other way altogether. There was one person, not naming the person. Only one person might remember the person who is sitting here in the room with us right now. But all those years ago, there was one person that every Sunday would tell me all the things that were wrong with the sermon from last week. But he would wait to tell me that until 15 minutes before the next worship service. So whatever I did wrong with worship last Sunday, imagine coming to church on Sunday, maybe you had a service before that, or I used to teach Sunday school for adults at the 9:30 time slot, and the 11 o'clock service rolled around. 15 minutes, almost. So I'll tell you what happened. Because I'm conflict averse, and because I didn't want to hear it, because it would suck the air out of me before I went in to try to preach again, is if I saw him coming down the hallway, I went another way. I turned around, went back in the sanctuary, went in the sacristy, locked the door. I would go somewhere else and avoid it. Eventually I got over that. And met head on one Sunday morning and said, listen, if you have problems with my sermon, there are 6 days between Sunday, right after church, all the way up through Saturday. You can call me. I've got office hours. You can come and talk to me. Any of those things. Tell me what's wrong with my sermon. Don't do it 15 minutes before worship. And he said, but James, that's the easiest time for me. And I said, well, I'm really glad for that. But I'm not going to listen. If you're going to start that way, I'm just going to walk away from now on. I'm just telling you right now. You can have problems with my sermon. I know that I'm not perfect, and I know that my sermons are sometimes out there. I get it. We have become, averse to all conflict in the world, the church as a whole sometimes. We don't want to stand up always for what's right. We don't want to stand up for the least of these because it might threaten our situation. It might threaten any one of the many benefits that come from being the church, particularly in the United States. It might offend somebody who gives a lot of money to make the church happy. So we should just, a nice pablum, nice baby's milk that makes everyone happy, just say those things and the world will be okay. Jesus modeled a different kind of truth. When we see something wrong in the world, particularly when a powerful person or entity is doing something wrong, we have to call them out. We have to call them out. Jesus had to call out the folks who had become comfortable in their pews. They didn't have pews in the first century. They stood, they would stand probably, or they might have stone benches. But pretty much that was the experience of worship in the first century for our Jewish sisters and brothers in synagogue. And he had to shake them out of their comfort zone. When we see something going wrong in the world, we need to stand up. But first we need to ask, is what we're standing up for just a preference of our own, or is it something God has called us to stand up about? Is it loving? Is that which God has called us to stand up for exclude more people or find a way to include more people, to invite more people? Because the only way God's love can transform the world in which we live is if all of our hearts and minds are transformed. I'm not suggesting that you go out and preach really mean sermons on the corner. You're a bunch of sinners and blah, blah, blah. Used to have a guy when I went to the University of Virginia in the 1980s who would show up periodically and just stand on the lawn, sort of a sacred space for people who went to the University of Virginia, the central part of the grounds, and would tell us all as we passed by that we were all going to hell. And it was, I don't think he ever won any converts for Christ that way. I don't think anybody came to believe in Jesus because of what he said. I do know that he embarrassed me about my faith. I was embarrassed. In fact, some people would ask me about it and I'd say, well, his faith's not my faith. And it probably isn't. My God is a lot more inclusive and welcoming and inviting, not just for all of you here, not just for all of you who watch online, but for more people. Because as God's love transforms the world around us, we stop seeing each other through the eyes of difference. We can celebrate our uniqueness because God does that. But we can also see that we are all loved by God and that will change us. People who are inside and people who are outside. Would you want to hear more if someone were talking to you about love, or more if someone were telling you about all the things that are wrong with you? If you'd only get your stuff together like me, God would really love you. Or God already loves you, and that love is going to help you see yourself and everyone you meet as already loved, and to proclaim that news, whether they come to St. James or not. Would we like them to come? Sure. But if they don't, that's okay. That's not a popular message. Churches that are growing today, a lot of them, spend a lot of time telling you who to hate. Those are still the fastest growing churches. Who is wrong, who to judge, who to vote for. Those, and I wonder really if they're churches or if they're not country clubs like Dr. B talked about. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for or who's in and who's out, because that's God's business. I am going to tell you that Jesus always loved, always made time, And sometimes doing so irritated all the other people around him, including his disciples. I want to challenge you to go out and be irritants in the world. Not just ugly to be ugly, but stand up for what's right when you see something going wrong. Stand for the least of these when you see them belittled on behalf of God. That is our calling. That is our calling.